Tonight I'm very excited to welcome Stephen Burt and David Mickix to discuss The Art of the Sonnet, an anthology that the two professors have co-edited. David Mickix is a professor of English at the University of Houston. He is a former Fulbright professor, and his previous books include A New Handbook of Literary Terms and most recently, Who Was Jacques Derrida? Stephen Burt is Associate Professor of English at Harvard. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Boston Review, among other publications. And his previous books include Close Calls with Nonsense and Parallel Play. Few poetic forms have been as long-lived or as adaptable as the sonnets. Professors Burt and Mickix have collected 100 of the finest examples of this 14-line poem. Together with the professor's commentary, The Art of the Sonnet provides readers a deeper appreciation of this enduring and expressive form. Publishers Weekly said of the book, learned and passionate, The Art of the Sonnet is a delight.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to add one thing that although this is an anthology, it's also, I mean, you said as much, it's also commentaries on 100 poems. We've chosen 100 poems from the Renaissance to the present. And on each poem, we've given you about 3 pages of discussion to try to open those poems up for you. So although we're anthologists, we're also commentators.
Yes, critics, one might say.
We shouldn't be ashamed about that. So why don't we just give a few words of introduction about what the sonnet is, where it came from, why is it so familiar, so recognizable?
Yeah. Well, the easiest of those questions to answer is where it came from, and the answer is Sicily.
Very easy. Yeah, to be more specific, 13th century Sicily, very interesting fellow, Frederick II. He shows up in Dante, actually. Dante puts him in hell with some misgivings. I mean, he actually was rather fond of the memory of Frederick, but he does put him in hell. And Frederick, as I said, he's an interesting fellow. He has a passion for falconry, for Roman law, and he had a considerable menagerie, including camels, panthers, and an elephant. However, we remember him because he was also a big fan of poetry, and he gathered around him a circle of 12 notaries, they were called, and they practiced the art of the sonnet. They were the first sonneteers.
Yeah, and what they are doing when they are inventing the sonnet, whether or not they realize that this is what they are doing, is separating, arguably for the first time in Western European vernacular literature, poetry that is meant to be read and read aloud and read silently and reread from poetry that is lyric in the more restricted sense of being something you sing. Because the sonnet, with its 8 and 6, and later we'll come to know it for other variations, but when sonnet form becomes standardized for the first time in Italy, which you might say only happens with Petrarch, right? But what Petrarch realized was happening, what the Sicilian poets made possible, was the creation of a form of poetry that is lyric in the sense that it's interiorized, it is song-like. It's descended from song. It is emotive, although it also gets used for other things, then and now, satire, for example. But it's not something that you're supposed to sing. It doesn't have a refrain. It doesn't have one kind of stanza that gets repeated over and over, and it lends itself to kinds of subtlety and to, you might even say, kinds of implicit narration that we don't think of as the province of lyric song.
This is the big hook, really, the big draw of the sonnet is what Steve just mentioned, that its name, in fact, means little song in Italian, sonetto. But all lyric poetry in some sense is song, but the sonnet becomes something else, too. I mean, songs are cyclical, you walk along singing, your song goes on. The sonnet is not cyclical, it's conclusive. It's a little argument.
Yeah.
It turns on itself. As Steve said, the main feature of the sonnet, the one shared by nearly all sonnets, is that it's divided asymmetrically.
There is a turn, there are parts, the parts are not the same size, and so they are unequal in other ways.
We have an 8 and a 6, right? The octave, the first 8 lines, and the sestet, the second, the final 6 lines. And often there's a sort of aphoristic twist at the end of the sonnet, a kind of final stab. But it's speaking of music, it's something that you do find also in music. The volta or the turn. Volta means turn in Italian. The hinge or the pivot between the first 8 lines and then the final 6 lines. It's like the bridge in music. It's like, here we go. Let's take it to the bridge and we enter a new phase. And frequently you have the sonnet answering itself, turning on itself. It's like a syllogism. If A, then B. Or if A, then also B. Or if A, even more A.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes. And of course, once it is recognized as a form with its own history, you have sonnets that answer other sonnets that answer other sonnets, and you have parodies. One of the disappointments of a project like this one, of any anthology, but especially of an anthology that is also a book of criticism, a book of commentaries, a book with only 100 sonnets in it. One of the disappointments is that you come across or you have occasion to think about so many interesting poems that don't make the final cut.
You also have occasion to read a lot of very bad poems.
Oh yeah. Well, of making bad sonnets, there is no end. But I have in mind, in particular, a set of poems called Gulling Sonnets.
That you wanted to include.
That we decided not to include. That I didn't really want to include anymore.
Fond as we are of Gulling, we did not.
Right. They're not funny enough for a modern audience to justify. Including them in a book that has only.
They were funny in 1600, but not.
They are very funny once you have read many Elizabethan sonnets, and if you have occasion to read entire Elizabethan sonnet sequences, and I hope you do. Once you have read all of Shakespeare's sonnets, all of Astrophil and Stella, some Michael Drayton, some Mary Roth, some other Elizabethan sonneteers, I recommend that you find, and they're not too hard to find, John Davies's Gulling Sonnets. One of which makes fun of the elaborate legal or pseudo-legal language in which arguments about love were cast. One of which is a set of detachable metaphors for the lover. It is a series of sonnets that makes clear how, by the Elizabethan time, this was a separate tradition that you could make fun of.
So yeah, people are forever returning to this. It's probably the most popular verse form now. It's certainly the most recognizable.
Yeah.
It's it's also the verse form that has the most instances of self-commentary. Sonnets about the sonnet. In fact, there's a whole anthology of sonnets on the sonnet.
Yes.
And some of the famous examples are by Wordsworth. Scorn not the sonnet.
Scorn not the sonnet critics. Yeah.
Nuns fret not at their convent's narrow room. The sonnet is a narrow room, like the nun's cell. But that's a good thing. And then Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who the sonnet is a moment's monument. So the sonnet is small. It's jewel-like, right?
Yeah.
It's like the moment that it captures, but it's also a little monument. It commemorates.
Yeah. And it becomes strongly associated by the end of the 19th century, which is when you get the anthology by Matthew Russell, who is also a Jesuit father. When Matthew Russell puts together this fun anthology of sonnets about the sonnet. When you have I would say the fourth in the 1880s. Would you say the fourth of the great waves of sonnet writing? Decade or so periods in which everyone seems to be writing sonnets and sonnet sequences, the 80s after Rossetti publishes his. You have an association of sonnets with the poetry of the past. The sonnet is the gem-like, self-contained, self-conscious, and often self-consciously beautiful or pretty, sometimes self-consciously monumental after Milton, example of what poetry in English and in other Western European languages has already done. And that means a number of modernist poets either decide not to write them, or write them early on and then reject them, or tell their friends and their epigones and their readers to reject them. William Carlos Williams at one point calls the sonnet a fascist form. Later on, he writes them. Ezra Pound wrote several sonnets that used to be more famous than they now are. The most famous one was called A Virginal, and it is a very, very insistent comparison of whiteness and white things to the beautiful woman he's praising, and it's very traditional, but doesn't give us as much pleasure now as it did then. But Pound gives up on sonnets at a time when he's still writing quatrains and other kinds of forms. The sonnet becomes a synecdoche, a part taken for the whole of English and European literary history. And one of the few things that you can say about most sonnets being written now is that they're poems that are conscious that poetry has a long history. They do not want to repudiate that history.
Shall we read some poems?
Is it time to read poems?
I think it's time to read poems.
Okay.
So let's read some poems. And the first poem, I'm willing to bet that most of you, maybe almost all of you, if you've ever been to a wedding, knows this poem. And even for those of you who haven't been to a wedding recently, you may know this poem. It's Shakespeare's Sonnet 116. Of course, Shakespeare is the most famous sonnet writer in the tradition, certainly in English. I think the greatest writer of sonnets, and he's also the strangest writer of sonnets. Shakespeare's sonnets are one of the most bizarre works ever penned by a human being. And there's, as you know, if you've dipped into them or read through them, there's a sort of near fanatic emotional intensity to the sonnet. It's just this vast storm, the sonnet sequence. We have 126 sonnets about the poet's love for a certain young man. And he gets stabbed in the back. He forgives the young man for stabbing him in the back. He thinks better of this, etc., etc. It goes on, it goes on. And then we have the demonic figure of the dark lady who takes over near the end of the sequence. But Sonnet 116 is different. It seems like a kind of island of security or of calm in the midst of this tempest. So first let me read it, and then I'll say just a couple of things about it quickly. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh, no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. That's the octave, by the way. I hate to interrupt. Now comes the sestet, the final 6 lines. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out, even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So it's quite something, and although it may be hard to hear it with fresh ears since we've heard it so much, but one of the things that we do, a few of the things that we do in our commentary, we take a look at some of the background of this poem. Shakespeare is actually alluding to the Book of Common Prayer, to the marriage ceremony in the Book of Common Prayer, something that was used for centuries. Although this particular formulation was dropped in the 20th century, mid-20th century. If there's anybody here at this marriage who knows any reason why the couple should not get married, for example, if they're already married, one of them, if there are any impediments, that's the word used, please come up and speak out, and then the truth will be tried. So this is... this is part of the marriage. So what that suggests is that what Shakespeare is doing here is he's testifying. He's a sort of witness. In what direction is he testifying? He's saying, is this about the truth or the steadfastness of love? Well, in part, but when we look through the sonnet, we find that he expresses certain doubts. It starts even in line 2. Love is not love. Here's that phrase stuck right at the end of that line. Love is not love? Why would he? What it's a kind of a shocker.
The preceding sonnets give a number of instances in which love, in fact, is not love. What looks like love is something else. The way we define love turns out to be wrong. The love he seeks turns out not to exist. We've seen a number of instances in which love is not love, and will this be one of them? Well...
Yeah, exactly. That's the question, right? And then he says, well, no, love is an ever-fixed mark, right? It's like the pole star that guides navigators. Or it's like the beacon of a lighthouse, right, which is called a sea mark. And, that looks on tempests and is never shaken. But then he goes on to say something that also makes us doubt, whose worth's unknown. He's talking about this fixed mark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. So why is love's worth described as unknown? If it does help us navigate, if it is this ideal that we could orient ourselves by, what's unknown about it? And what does Shakespeare think about that? Another biggie, another big question. And then finally, death comes in, right? We have in the sestet, when the sonnet moves, we have a much more vibrant image. Love's not time's fool, right? So a fool is, just as it means to us, somebody who's been duped or deluded. But also in the Renaissance, it means darling. Love is not the beloved of time. Yeah. Time lords it over love. And in fact, time uses a sickle, right? Time is death.
Yeah. Love is not subordinate to time. Love is not subordinate to anything, says that third quatrain. It is rather triumphalist. And you might say that it tempts us to hear Shakespeare saying that love will in fact conquer all.
Yeah, it certainly does tempt us. And it says, in fact, a beautiful phrase, but love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. So to bear it out is to endure, right? But also to prove something, to demonstrate something, to bear out a point, right?
And this exists, this ending, not just that end of that sentence, but the whole sestet exists in tension. And you get to decide, or you get to debate how that tension is resolved with the instances elsewhere in Shakespeare's other sonnets in which indeed love alters. And not only does love alter, it alters indeed with people's faces. It alters in hours and weeks, and it alters in years, as in the first, 18 sonnets, where Shakespeare is urging, and we've got one of them in here, urging, don't we?
Yeah.
Urging a young man to marry and beget children.
Right. One of the strangest arguments ever in literature.
There are a number of reasons why Shakespeare thinks the young man should do this, but one of them is that the young man is beautiful, and if the young man doesn't print his image on somebody else, that is a son, a child, the young man's beauty will be lost because he'll be old and wrinkly.
You'll be cheating future generations who will want to admire your handsomeness.
Right. But can't, because the young man indeed will be altered, as we will all be altered, our person will be altered. But love as a quality, or as a feeling, as a bond between one person and another, this sentence, this part of this sonnet claims, does not alter.
Why don't we go on to a very different poem?
Yeah, well, did you want to talk about that couplet?
Oh, the couplet.
The couplet is waiting for you.
Okay, it's waiting for me. I didn't know. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So what is that? Is that a kind of legalistic out? Or does he expect that this will be error? That he might be erring? What do you think? It's always the case when somebody tells you to talk about something, you tell them to talk about it instead.
Well, at least the claim, the argument that we make, and the way the version, and it's very well supported by the audience that this poem has found. The argument that we make here is that we are unless I misunderstand what you're. Where you ended up going with this, is that the sonnet tempts us to see in it a kind of bleak irony, kind of, well, if I'm not in love, then forget it. No one loves anyone. We'll all go home. But that is a temptation the sonnet, in fact, resists. That it does say at the end, use me at weddings. This is, if we're going to have an idea about love, if anyone has ever been in love, then love must indeed be like this. It must be able to have these triumphs and these forms of endurance. It must be like the North Star.
Yeah.
And since
Take it from me, he says.
Take it from me, yeah. Yeah. But like a lot of Shakespeare's sonnets, and you see this very fast when you get into the debates that have been held over how to read them, it tempts us into adopting and debating contradictory positions, and indeed it contains those debates within itself. Another thing you discover when you look at the reception history of Shakespeare's sonnets is that people didn't always love them. Shakespeare becomes, in the 18th century, Britain's great playwright, the symbol of British greatness in a lot of ways. But he's not necessarily Britain's great sonnet writer or Britain's great lyric poet. It takes quite a while. It takes until Wordsworth's time for readers of English poetry, poets writing poetry in English, poets writing sonnets, to come to some sort of consensus that Shakespeare's sonnets are wonderful. And indeed, you find voices of dissent on this even up to the 19th century.
Okay, let's move to Newfoundland.
Let's move to Newfoundland. We have taken more time on Shakespeare.
Yeah. So
Than
we'll
expected.
be skipping over Frost and Yeats and Wordsworth and all other sorts of
We
goodies.
can come back to them. We can come back. To them.
You can
Start a
ask
bit
us
late.
about these various
You can.
poets. We really give you a spectrum here, though. We have New Zealand, we have Australia, and India, and we have
have Canada. We have Atlantic Canada.
Yes.
Yeah. The sonnet by now has been attempted and executed with a great deal of interest and beauty. In almost every large literary community where English is a literary medium. One of those places is the island province of Newfoundland. I suppose it's Newfoundland and Labrador, isn't it? It's not entirely an island. Canadians here? No. The people are in Newfoundland, by and large.
Canadians?
In Newfoundland, no Canadians here, apparently, or no one is willing to admit to being Canadian. Canadian poetry has in a lot of ways taken its own track, separate from U.S. poetry in the past 2 generations or so. And when you go down that track, one of the people you find is the Newfoundland-based poet Mary Dalton, who writes in Newfoundland English. She writes in a kind of dialect, and she does very traditional things. Things that tie her to other parts of the Celtic world, to Scotland and Ireland, and things that tie her to the English Renaissance love sonnet. This is a poem of invitation, a poem of erotic invitation, a poem that belongs to a genre that is older than the sonnet. It's a poem that has a turn in the middle, and you'll hear it. It's a poem that fantasizes about a kind of erotic encounter that probably isn't going to happen. Or that happens only in the literary imagination of the person who is reciting it, thinking it to herself. The person who is thinking it to herself is a woman in a very traditional part of that fishing economy of Newfoundland, that weather-beset coast of Newfoundland. And you want to know, before you hear it, that the Fog Man is a legendary figure in Newfoundland folklore who controls the weather, which is usually bad.
Well, you think it's bad, but...
Oh, they think it's bad. They think it's bad. They like to complain about it. That's part of Newfoundland folklore. That Dickie is short for Richard. It's a man's name. That the walls of Troy is a pattern that Newfoundland women used to draw in sand on the floors of their kitchen. This is an obsolescent folk art. And that they really did used to eat seal fins all the time. And the last thing you want to know is that the title, Flurip, refers to a torch or a light source that you can see by in bad weather on a fishing platform, where you'd bring in the fish and have them caught. So this is a very local, very Newfoundland, and very contemporary, too, piece of dialect poetry, but it's also in one of the oldest traditions, oldest kinds of sonnet there is, a sonnet of erotic invitation to a love that's never really going to be realized. And the woman who is speaking, well, she tells you where she is and what she hopes will happen and who she's watching. The poem by Mary Dalton is called Flurip. And I'm not going to get the accent right. I'm not even going to try. fairy squalls on the water. I'm marooned at the window, waiting for the fog man, sewing the old black veil, the walls of Troy on the floor. There's Dickie just gone up the road in a red shirt. He's sure not the fog man, traipsing along with the swagger of a swiler in the spring fat. Not a feather out of him. Now he'd be the one to have in for a feed of fresh flippers, a taste of my fine figgy cake.
You really think that he's not going to show up?
Not today. Not today, no. He'd be the one, suggests, that he's not on his way into her house. Maybe next week, maybe
I
tomorrow.
think she can conjure him that she'll make him show up through this poem.
I think she hopes so. I think it's not out of the question. It's not out of the question. But it hasn't happened yet. That poem, you see this in Sidney's Astrophyll and Stella, you see it in a number of places in the Renaissance, the poem of prospective love, where the erotic encounter, the physical encounter, hasn't been ruled out, but it hasn't happened yet, and it might never happen.
But that might not matter because you still have the poem.
Well, that's right. This is a poem of erotic achievement, anterior to whatever physical experience is going to come. And it's a poem that substitutes also taste. And I'm told that seal flipper actually is quite wonderful if it's prepared
Who
right.
told you that?
The Dictionary of Newfoundland English, and the poet herself actually. One of the fun things about writing on contemporary poetry is that when you really don't know what something means, you can ask the poet. Not all of the poets responded to our queries, but Dalton was one of the ones who did, and we do quote her responses in here. This poem doesn't rhyme. She does write rhyming sonnets. This is not one of them. We're pretty sure it's a sonnet. I'm pretty sure it's a sonnet. I'm pretty sure it belongs in a book called The Art of the Sonnet because it takes into itself, as do our other unrhymed sonnets, so many of the other aspects that the form has traditionally had. It belongs to a kind of poetry defined by topic and tone and imagined scene as well as form. It's got, of course, 14 lines, and it's got a turn, a volta, and there's even punctuation telling you it's got a volta. There's an em dash after the 8th line. It's got a scene that it sets. It tells you what it's seeing in the octave, and then by the end in the sestet, it tells you instead what she's imagining. He hasn't come in to eat the figgy cake yet. He hasn't partaken of her scrumptious wares.
So what next?
What next? I'm sorry we can't feed you figgy cake. We can.
I'm getting hungry.
We can. I'm always hungry. We can read you a couple of other poems. We've got some in mind. We can also take wider ranging questions. It is very tempting. It may be a bad idea, but it's tempting for us to say, what sort of sonnet would you like to hear? And then we'll see whether any of our 100 selections matches your request. Sonnet roulette, if you like.
You like funny, sad?
We can do that. Funny. Hunt?
Yeah.
Hunt. This one is especially fun because it's actually 3 sonnets for the price of 1. And David, shall we... do you want the first and third, or do you want the second?
I'll take the second.
Okay. Leigh Hunt is best known as a friend and mentor to Keats, as a political radical, as a magazine publisher, as a guy who was in jail for sedition during the 18 teens, as an introducer and a translator of Italian literature into England, and as a writer of fun essays. If you think of David Sedaris, not quite the same affect, but fun, light reading. But Hunt also wrote poetry, and most of it's not very good, but some of it's a great deal of fun. And this is, I think, his single best poem. It is a set of 3 sonnets from 1836 called collectively The Fish, The Man, and The Spirit. And it has, it's spoken by those figures. The first sonnet is spoken by a man to a fish, and it is subtitled, To a Fish. You strange, astonished-looking, angle-faced, dreary-mouthed, gaping wretches of the sea, gulping salt water everlastingly, cold-blooded, though with red your blood be graced, and mute, though dwellers in the roaring waste, and you all shapes beside that fishy be, some round, some flat, some long, all devilry, legless, unloving, infamously chaste. Oh, scaly, slippery, wet, swift, staring whites, what is't you do? What life lead, eh, dull goggles? How do you vary your vile days and nights? How pass your Sundays? Are ye still but joggles and ceaseless wash? Still naught but gapes and bites and drinks and stares, diversified with boggles?
A fish answers, amazing monster! That, for aught I know, with the first sight of thee, didst make our race forever stare. O flat and shocking face, grimly divided from the breast below. Thou, that on dry land horribly dost go, with a split body and most ridiculous pace. Prong after prong, disgracer of all grace. Long useless finned, haired, upright, unwet, slow. O breather of unbreathable, sword-sharp air, how canst exist? How bear thyself, thou dry and dreary sloth? What particle canst share of the only blessed life, the watery? I sometimes see of ye an actual pair go by, linked fin by fin, most odiously.
The fish turns into a man and into a spirit, and again speaks. Indulge thy smiling scorn, if smiling still, O man, and loath, but with a sort of love. For difference must its use by difference prove, and in sweet clang the spheres with music fill. One of the spirits am I, that at his will live in whatever has life, fish, eagle, dove. No hate, no pride, beneath naught nor above, a visitor of the rounds of God's sweet skill. Man's life is warm, glad, sad, twixt loves and graves, boundless in hope, honored with pangs austere, heaven-gazing, and his angel wings he craves. The fish is swift, small-needing, vague yet clear, a cold, sweet, silver life, wrapped in round waves, quickened with touches of transporting fear.
That's it. And it's a very beautiful line. I mean, it's a funny poem, but it's also a beautiful one. A cold, sweet, silver life wrapped in round waves. I mean, that's really stunning, I think. I was just reading a book called Do Fish Have Feelings? New book.
Do fish have feelings?
Well, the evidence suggests perhaps, yeah. So, anyway.
Yikes. The question is, did we include Malay? And the answer is yes. We've got a poem of hers called Bluebeard, which is not entirely obscure. You do find it in selections of her work, but it's not in very many other anthologies, and she's one of the poets where we tried not to include the same poems everybody else includes, because there are poems that are just as good or even better. And this is a very haunting, I would say, poem that seems to be spoken by, well, who do you think speaks?
Blueberry. What?
By
victim.
Well,
Man, woman, who knows?
we don't know. It's not entirely clear whether we are to hear Bluebeard himself speaking and defending himself, whether we are to hear a woman speaking, a modern Bluebeard. What we do know in this poem is that the crypt, if you know the Bluebeard story, do we need to retell the Bluebeard story, or should we just, no, we don't?
Well, do people know the Bluebeard? No, we don't need to. Yes.
Yeah.
We know Bluebeard.
What you find in this poem, where is it?
Well, let's read the first line. This door you might not open, and you did. So it's like, but at the end, it seems like Bluebeard is fleeing. His secret has been discovered. He says, "This now is yours. I seek another place."
Yeah, and in some people don't know the story. That in the various fairy tale versions of Bluebeard, he's a malevolent figure who keeps marrying women and then killing them, and marries the heroine of the story and says, "There's one chamber in my house that you can't go into." She finds the key. There are several versions of this. She opens it up and discovers all these corpses of previous brides, and then in the most familiar versions, saves herself or is saved. But Malay's Bluebeard, who has been hiding something, and says, "This door you might not open, and you did," hasn't been hiding corpses or violent crimes. This Bluebeard, who may be a woman, says, "So enter now and see for what slight thing you are betrayed. Here is no treasure hid, no cauldron, no clear crystal mirroring the sought-for truth, no heads of women slain. What's in there? An empty room, cobwebbed and comfortless. Yet this alone out of my life I kept unto myself, lest any know me quite. And you did so profane me when you crept unto the threshold of this room tonight, that I must never more behold your face. This now is yours. I seek another place."
So as you can see, it's a very interesting poem, and it's not your typical. I mean, it's not one of the most familiar Malay sonnets. So we really did some digging here.
Some. It is in
We're covered with dirt. Still.
We are covered with dirt. I should say that J.D. McClatchy's wonderful Selected Malay, which really does try to do justice to all the parts of her career, does include this poem. So it's not as if we had to find it in an old periodical. It is out there. I hope you're not disappointed as a Malay fan.
Yeah, well, it's one of those formal questions that it's difficult to have a general answer to, just because poets can do so many different things, with the same form. The closed or the open quatrain is what you're talking about. Open is A B A B, and closed is A B B A, ABBA. Yes. But would you care to hazard? You're a poet, and I'm not. So.
Now you have me thinking about Dancing Queen, which is merely coincidental. The most famous and most imitated Italian sonnets, which were referred to by people writing in English for a while as correct or proper or regular or genuine sonnets, use the form that Petrarch used. In which the first 8 lines rhymed A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. It is much easier to do that without straining the sense or giving yourself a massive headache if you are writing in Italian. It's harder in English.
So you're saying that poets are just trying to have it easy, and that's why they...
Well, some poets are. This form, which can be standard in Italian the way A-B-A-B quatrains are often standard in English, becomes a special effect in English, something that's hard to do. You might try to do it because it's what your friends expect. And in the late 16th century, what your friends expected could clearly influence what you wrote, because poetry was really written very often for coteries, for very small audiences. You might do it to show off. You might do it because you value, as Edmund Spenser did, particular effects of smoothness or repetition. Or you might really be showing off. Donne's Holy Sonnets, the octaves rhyme that way, don't they?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, they do.
Yeah, and there he's showing off.
Right. And we should mention, and this is sort of implied in as you said, the first 8 lines have just 2 rhyme words generally, most of the time, in a Petrarch sonnet. And with Shakespeare's sonnets, as you know, are A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So,
Now, you will see, especially in the 19th and 20th century, poets invent hybrid rhyming forms that are neither Petrarchan nor Shakespearean. Geoffrey Hill has sonnets where the octave rhymes A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C. And in that instance, you just have to say the poet wanted the form that would serve the poem.
If you can dance to it, it's a sonnet.
It's very tempting to say that it's a family resemblance notion, that I'm willing to call a poem a sonnet if it has any 6 of 8 characteristics. and I pulled the number 8 out of thin air, and now I have to generate 8. Shell, do you want to help?
No, well, I think the one overriding feature that I think all 100 of the poems we collected and discussed, that one feature that they all have is the volta, the turn between the first 8 lines and the final 6 lines.
Yeah.
So that to me is the primary feature. But you know, the other features, various questions of rhyme scheme, the character of the sonnet. I think the fact that it's a 14-line poem, that you know it's ending in 14 lines, that you know there's only so much space, there's only so much time. This gives as I said before, it gives the sonnet a very conclusive character.
We do include at least one poem that has more than 14 lines, don't we?
That's true.
The Greville, yeah.
We also have sonnet. Yeah, not all sonnets have 14 lines.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Not all people have 10 fingers.
No. Now you have been thinking about cats with unusual numbers of fingers who are still cats. Are there cats in this book?
No, we have no poems about cats. That was.
Next time. We'll do that next time. The sonnet becomes harder to define, harder to give both necessary and sufficient conditions on sonnetness, on which writers and readers agree, partly because all forms are harder to define now after modernism, but partly because the longer a tree grows, if it's a tree of a certain kind, the farther apart its branches are from one another. And over the last, in English, I would say 150 years, it's become possible to choose which of the major branches of the sonnet tradition you want to have your own little flower come off. And so it's not a surprise that the sonnets in some ways become more and more unlike one another as you get closer to the present, and as you not coincidentally have more sonnets to deal with. But they do all have voltas. They do all have turns somewhere.
I can't think of anything, but we have actually a Dickinson specialist here who would know better than I do. But as you're pointing out, officially she has no sonnets.
Since all her poems have turns in them of some sort, and she wrote, what are there, 1,800? She wrote about 1,800 poems. I bet there's one with 14 lines. That means that there's one that you could, if you really wanted to, argue that we ought to view this in the constellation of sonnets, and there may be more than one. We, as we looked, and we did look, didn't find a poem of Dickinson's that we thought represented Dickinson at her best and ought to be viewed with this particular lens. But I suspect that if you wanted to find such a poem, you probably could. However, Dickinson thinks so strongly in the overwhelming majority of her poems in terms of separable stanzas. They're not always quatrains. Sometimes they're 3-line units, but usually they're quatrains. In terms of quatrain, 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 and one thing that a sonnet never is a poem composed entirely of stanzas that are the same size.
There's a sense in... I was just going to mention, there's a beautiful image that the critic C.L. Barber has for Shakespeare's sonnets, which are 3 quatrains and a couplet, 3 4-line units, then a 2-line unit at the end. And he says, it's like a figure skater tracing one circle, and then another wider circle, and then another one, and then you come back for a little turn at the end. And it's kind of a musical. It's ice skating, but it's a kind of a musical metaphor as well. You sort of do something and you do it again a little bit wider. And I don't think Dickinson does that. I think that as you said, her stanzas are units. They're sharp units, and there's a gap between them.
Yeah. She has poems that have conceptual asymmetries, where the way you're supposed to view the poem changes. But she does think stanzaically, I would say. Since that didn't get amplified, I'll kind of restate it briefly. Yeah. Martin Greenup, who is a Dickinson scholar, points out that Dickinson not only thought and worked in same-size stanzas, but that these are ballad stanzas of 4 and 3 beats per line, which means they don't have 5 beats and 10 syllables per line. They're not usually indebted to iambic pentameter, which sonnets in English tend to be.
Yeah, very much so. And Petrarch was the progenitor of this in the 14th century. 14th century Italy. He makes a pun on Laura, Laura, like our Laura, his beloved, whom he had a very glancing acquaintance with, let's put it that way. And the laurel crown, which is the same, it's pronounced very similarly, laurel, the crown that the leaves that poets are crowned with. So it's like, if you don't get the girl, you can at least get the poem. And the poem is really better in many ways. So
I've been craning my neck around because I thought I had a copy of Dante's Vita Nova behind me, which I don't. It is also lost. But Dante's prosometrum, his sequence of sonnets and prose about how he came to write those sonnets, called the Vita Nova, would be another example of that, would you say? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then Beatrice, his beloved, as you know, she then leads him through, the three realms, hell, purgatory, paradise, and, so that's much better than a real-life girlfriend. A spiritual guide. But it's poetry that accomplishes this. There's a great line by W.H. Auden in his lectures on Shakespeare. It's not about the sonnets, but he says, that poetry is a very good poetry is a very bad means of seduction, although bad poetry may be effective on occasion. So, good poetry is not, it's about itself more than it is about persuading someone to do something, though it may pretend to do that. Would you agree?
No, actually. But I will agree that quite a lot of poetry functions as what Kenneth Burt calls secular prayer, some way of conjuring into being through language a constellation or an imagined other world in which we get what we can't get outside of literature. I do think there are poems that really are efforts to persuade, that really are supposed to have rhetorical force, but they may be the exception among the poems that we admire.
Very abundant. There's a sonnet traditions not just in Italian, in Spanish, in German, in Hebrew, lots of languages and lots of material. And so what we could have written the book that was 2,000 pages long, but our publisher was reluctant. And so what we decided to do was include only a couple of foreign language sonnets, one by Rilke, who's amazingly influential on English language poets and a wonderful poet, very great poet, and Baudelaire also for French. And then we have Lope de Vega in Spanish. So, and then we talk about Petrarch. We discuss a poem by Petrarch in the introduction. So, the Italian tradition is very, very important and the root of the English tradition.
Yeah. In the 16th century in particular, there's not a bright line between original poetry in English and translations. Quite a lot of the earliest well-known and influential sonnets in English by Wyatt and others are free translations or adaptations or responses to pre-existing works in Italian and a little later in French. So there's not a bright line.
They called it imitation.
They still call it imitation.
So
thank you so much for coming. Thanks to the bookstore and thanks to GBH, right? Thank you, GBH.